What happens is a lot of these things, people complain the most when they have the least water, which is during drought. Then it'll rain for a year or two and it goes away. But the general trends are very clear with climate change that there's drying systems in all these places. So I suspect it'll become much more confrontational.
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights in Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sager, and in this podcast, you'll hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You have just heard from Peter Waldman, a senior reporter at Bloomberg Businessweek. Peter has been writing about global tensions around water, including who has access to it, who controls it, and what happens when water becomes a commodity. My colleague Salil Tripathi has been looking into this. He spoke to Peter and to Ravi Mariwala, founder and MD of an Indian water company called Smaart Water, about how we balance public access to water with the interests of the private sector. Salil's with you now. Salil, tell me about water as a human right, because it hasn't always been explicitly recognized as such, has it?
You're right, absolutely, Deborah, because when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted in 1948, there was no explicit recognition of water as a human right. There was the right to food, there was the right to land, the right to health, right to life, and water was embedded in all of that. But there wasn't an explicit right until much later, although it was recognized as such always that water is an essential element that we need for human life to survive. So that was a starting point of that, but it is now recognized as one. So at least there is recognition there. There is a CEO water mandate, which was created where businesses that are engaged with using water or distributing water are taking more responsibility towards what they do and how they work around it. And of course, the issue becomes important because water has to be ultimately distributed and clean and given to people through pipelines, and someone has to own that infrastructure. And there is a cost involved with that. Business element comes there too.
Absolutely. Well, have you decided to look at this topic now?
I think it is a perennial topic, right, at one level, because if you look at some of the earliest jurisprudence on economic, social, and cultural rights, we have to go back to South Africa, where Nelspruit and other cases took place, where communities wanted access to water, and South Africa's constitution recognized water as a human right, and it became a litigable issue. Similarly, the European Union also had something called the Universal Service Obligation, which recognized that everyone and every family and every household has a right to a certain amount of water for free. So that was already being recognized at the level of what companies ought to do and how they should go about it. But it has also become a strategic element. Water has rarely been weaponized, but increasingly it is becoming so. The current dispute that is going on between India and Pakistan is a good example, where the Indus Water Treaty, India wants to tear it up and prevent the water going into the Pakistani territories. And already the International Court has ruled against it. India says it will not be recognizing that judgment. Similarly, the access to water in Palestine, in Gaza, is extremely hard now, given the kind of infrastructural damage that has happened because of bombing. And therefore, the role that governments play in denying water to civilians has become very acute. Now, sometimes companies end up being complicit in it. And the most well-known example goes back to about two decades ago in Bolivia, in a town called Cochabamba. And it was in Cochabamba that you had an American company, Bechtel, which was given the contract to provide water to homes. Now, a lot of people in Bolivia, in Cochabamba, had water taps and water wells in their own homes. And yet, the company came and installed meters, and that led to an opposition of that, and that led to protests, demonstrations, and violations, and ultimately the contract had to be rescinded. So water is, of course, extremely essential for life, but it can be a source of tension, and companies can get caught in the middle of their crossfire.
So, Salil, why did you want to speak to Peter and Ravi particularly about this?
So Peter is a storyteller. He's a journalist. He tells us what's going on. And in a way, Ravi is the object of some of these things because he's a doer. He's the one who actually is in the water business. So I thought it was quite fascinating to try to talk to them. Because as a journalist, Peter has been investigating the role of business as an owner, as an investor, as a venture capitalist, it is involved. These companies are involved in activities around water and access to the water in different parts of the world. So that's one part of it. And Ravi works in a developing country where access to water is pretty hard. Some areas are arid, some areas where the rich people are able to access water more quickly and more easily than the poor can. And he's in a situation where even there are waterborne diseases and water is often contaminated. And the role that his company plays in purifying that water is an important one. So I just thought a conversation with the two of them would be quite interesting. And Peter began by telling me about some of the work he has been doing in Africa and Australia and the United States in trying to understand what's happening in the dynamic between businesses and water.
Indeed, we did write a series of articles. We called them Water Grab in 2023. We were a finalist for a Pulitzer and won a United Nations award. So it did get quite a bit of recognition, which I'm grateful for. And the recognition was really to the people out there in these countries, in these places that have been coping with what has been the growth of essentially institutional investors, including very large agro-industrial enterprises, crowding out the small people, the normal people, the average people, the folks who are in small farms, in small villages. In California's case, they are the entire country of Senegal, because that's a unique place where the main city, which is a good share of the population, over 20%, Dakar, depends on a single freshwater lake, Lac de Guiers, in the northern part of Senegal, which is essentially a floodplain area that fills up from the waters coming down the Senegal River, which come all the way through some 2,000 kilometers from the highlands in Guinea and Niger, and come through the mountains and end up on the plain of Senegal, which is, of course, right on the edge of the Atlantic in the widest part of Africa, in the western tip of Africa. And at that point in Lac de Guiers, they're supplying water for about half the population of the 5 million people in Dakar, and there's never enough. They don't have the infrastructure, nor, frankly, the volume of fresh water for the population concentrating in the city. Meanwhile, an American multinational investment fund got their hands on about 20,000 hectares of land, of farmland, right on the edge of Lac de Guiers to grow alfalfa. This American firm listed on the US stock exchange was raising capital to grow alfalfa, purpose of which was to export to Saudi Arabia for their own cattle feeding and for racehorses and other uses of livestock feed in Saudi Arabia, bypassing entirely the population. So it was essentially taking the water out of the households of Dakar, shipping it in the form of alfalfa grown on the shores of this lake in northern Senegal to the Gulf. And that was the subject of our article.
And you have a similar issue that you dealt with in Australia as well.
Australia, we tried to look at the solution to the water grab issue. They have developed in the 80s and 90s, during a period of great liberalization of the economy there, as it was many places in the world in the 90s, essentially a trading regime for water, using the free market as they structured it to trade. We're talking about primarily southeastern Australia, where there is this network of rivers called the Murray-Darling Basin. And those rivers intersect, and one can actually forego a water right generally in the north or in the east of that area where the water or the headwaters essentially emanate. And if you forego your right there, you can sell that water downriver because it naturally flows that direction. What we found in Australia as a result of the monetization of the river system there was the very wealthy agro-industrial enterprises in the north and the south. So at sort of the top and the bottom of this river system, were essentially sucking the middle dry. And it turned out that the most profitable in a globalized system of trade, the most profitable crops were cotton in the north and almonds, which we find nuts generally in many other places, including California, in the south. So you had investment capital flowing in, not just for the almond and the cotton land, which of course they did, but for the water rights themselves. And they grew those two crops in the north and south enormously at the expense of the traditional farming and food growing areas in the middle. And so in the middle of the Murray-Darling Basin, you had plummeting dairy production, for example, during the period that almonds and cotton were expanding, as well as plummeting food sources in other areas of growth. It was really quite striking what happened.
And what was the story in California?
California, we can summarize what a Mexican immigrant in Central California who manages wells for very small towns, farm worker towns, described to me as deeper pockets, deeper wells. And the impact of that is that the investors in almond lands, including UBS Bank from Switzerland, John Hancock Insurance, which is a unit of Manulife conglomerate in Canada, several others, one of the very largest Canadian pension funds, which actually handles the retirement money of the mounted police in Canada and others. These folks had invested in almond lands. We had horrible drought here in California in the first 2 decades of this century. And to keep these investments alive, literally, because these are permanent crops that need prodigious amounts of water year round, they needed to dig deeper wells. So they resourced the groundwater. And the result of that is they left many farm worker communities, small farmers, others with lesser means, high and dry. So you ended up with the typical investor drilled well going down about 1,000 feet or more, and the typical community well, whether it's farm workers or small farmers, going down less than half of that. And the result of that was to leave those wells high and dry. You had, in the worst year of our drought, 2022, you had 1 million households in California without clean drinking water, much of which was the result of this dynamic in the Central Valley of California where all this occurred.
So the uniting theme here is, of course, that big business sees it as an opportunity to make money, and it is leaving the small people, the common people, dry without trying to make a pun out of it. But the question, therefore, I have is what kind of resistance is developing? Are people organizing themselves? Are they able to protest? Are the protests being heard? Are they directed at the government or at the companies?
So in Senegal, there was quite a backlash. You have about 20 or 30,000 nomadic herds people in that area where this alfalfa operation was going. And when they started putting up barbed wire, particularly the Italian company that preceded the Americans put up barbed wire when they had a sunflower operation in the same place, and keeping out herdsmen and keeping out generally the women who are fetching the water, you had bitter outcry, and they protested both in person and then in Dakar when they went down, and there was a real scandal. And as it emerged that this American publicly listed company, controlled, by the way, by a famous Romanian, Australian, Swiss investor named Frank Timmis, who is well known in Africa, but also elsewhere, particularly in Romania, now in Greenland. He owns quite a bit of rare earth minerals there. He became the kind of battering shield, or the guy who really absorbed a lot of the most negative publicity, because it was quite apparent he had close relationships with both the two past presidents, and probably explained his ability to ascertain this land for the alfalfa farm. By the way, the land itself is on a state conservation reserve, a place that they were trying to preserve for birds and other habitats. So there was an outcry against him. California, the state legislature finally passed a law to control and try to maintain a sustainable groundwater deposit so that agricultural enterprises could only pump at the rate it was being replenished. That has a 40-year phase in, so there's still quite a bit of disapproval of what's going on there. Australia, the same story. There you had essentially a conservative government in the state of New South Wales that was allowing the cotton barons to do whatever they wanted. And of course, in the South, there was something similar. So they're not changing the trading regime down there. I think they're trying to tighten it through regulation. So there is pushback. But, what happens is a lot of these things, people complain the most when they have the least water, which is during drought. Then it'll rain for a year or two and it goes away. But the general trends are very clear with climate change, that there's drying systems in all these places. So I suspect it'll become much more confrontational.
I do want to come back to you on some good practices, Peter, but let me turn to Ravi here, because Ravi, the stories that Peter has told us are very compelling and heartrending, and they also tell us about the need for effective, workable, and fair and transparent grievance mechanisms and regulatory frameworks, which is based on rules. You operate in India, where you run a business built around water. Tell us what you do, how you try to ensure that water remains, as we said earlier, available, affordable, accessible, and of good quality. The four conditions that the human rights literature tells us are vital and crucial in this regard.
So just to give you a background, I started my journey in water about 15 years ago. I started with testing water because we were having a lot of issues with the quality of water, and that was the beginning of it. And from there, one thing led to another. So today I've got a company which provides integrated and holistic water solutions to private sector. And we work at a very small scale to a very large scale across the board. And these solutions involve a lot of things. They involve rainwater harvesting, groundwater recharge, extraction of water, purification, pumping of water, distribution, sewage treatment, irrigation water, and hot water also, depending on who the client is. So we encompass the whole spectrum of the water requirements, more or less the whole spectrum of the water requirement. We don't do as much work with industry as we would like to do, but now we are getting into that because we have got something differentiable compared to the others. My thesis has always been that whatever we do, make it sustainable and affordable. And one of the early things which I learned in this whole business was there is nothing like high tech or low tech. It is the right tech which matters. And for the application or for the use, the right tech matters. The right tech, what it means is it gives you the right quality, the right quantity, and the way in which people who are using it can interact with the technology very easily. And that's what I really focus on. And that has been my story. I think if I was to break down the water problem in India very naively, 15% is technology, 50% is water management, and balance, I would say, is raising the awareness of it. What I've learned over years is that we do not interact with water on a daily basis except in the bathrooms. If we don't know what is water, where it comes from, we don't really think deep about that particular part. Bombay is very well known as a hydraulic city, which is fed by 7 lakes, which collect water in the 4 months of monsoon, which is on right now in full swing in Mumbai. And that water gets distributed to the city of Bombay. But the irony is that the villages which were covered, or the people who are living around the lakes, do not get water from this pipe. So that accessibility has been given to the urban populations quite well. Bombay is blessed in that sense because I think Bombay is the only one where you get regular water. Elsewhere in the country, that water is not very easily available.
But there is a distortion, right? The distortion being that a lot of people are reliant on tankers and buy it from the water, and it's not necessarily supplied. It's just for the sake of listeners who are not from India.
Yeah, I just come to that also. What's happening is there is a pipeline which was laid, the infrastructure that has not been implemented at the rate at which the population and urbanization is happening. So the de facto mechanism of supplying waters is through tankers. And as a result, the access is a huge challenge. About 60% of Mumbai has got water through tankers. So there is not an adequate amount. The quality sometimes is a question mark also. In the last few years, the government of India has started a scheme called Har Ghar Mein Nal, which means that every house needs to have a tap, and they are implementing a lot of piping and taps just to at least get potable water across to various houses. And it is working in certain areas, it has not worked in certain areas. And the infrastructure requirements are massive out here. The larger question comes in is how do we get water into those taps? And that's where a lot of the challenges are coming and emerging, but a lot of things are happening in that space. I think the larger factor one needs to understand in India, which are two things. One is availability and accessibility, is how is the water used? What we see is about 85 to 87% of water is used for agriculture, which is not priced at any level or very, very minuscule level. About 6 to 7% of water is used by industry, and the balance also used for potable use. Industry is more or less subsidizing a lot of the water which goes for potable use as well as for agriculture. And agriculture today has got free electricity, free water, and as a result of it, our efficiency with respect to water is quite poor. And it's almost about 45 to 50% of the world average. So there is a need out here. And as Peter said that Senegal was exporting water in form of alfalfa. We are exporting water in form of sugar and rice. So that's a large challenge which we need to address. But once you give something to people, then taking it back is a very difficult part.
And there is this other very interesting argument of inequity in India, which is that the wealthier farmers are able to a better pumping technology and they tend to draw more water. And the poorer and the smaller and the marginal farmers, and a large number of Indian farmers are small and marginal, are not able to access it. And that creates its own cycle of injustices. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's also the large case also in the irrigated fields also. The rich farmers who have large tracts of land are able to use better pumps and suck the water first from the canals. So the marginalized or the smallhold farmers are not able to do that well. And as a result, we are having a lot of problems. And second issue which is coming is a lot of the farms are rain fed. And if there is a drought, that becomes a problem. And as a result, in certain parts of central India, you see a lot of farmer suicides which are happening. And that's mainly happening because of the drought, and they borrow heavily for their farms and not able to repay it back.
No, that's almost an epidemic level, and there has been some good work on that too. Now, if we were to string back to what Peter was saying, Ravi, he gave examples from Senegal, Australia, and California. As a company, what do you think those companies could have done differently in those cases? What would you propose? Is it about the investors demanding more from the companies themselves? Should the companies have better consultation policies? What kind of solutions do you see emerging?
One of the things which I feel that thinking a little differently is about the ownership of water. And whom does water belong to? I think that's a central question which we need to address. There has to be some kind of a regulation in terms of what and how you can use the water for. Okay. So that becomes very, very important. Metering of water becomes very important. And that also can lead to proper equitable distribution and so on and so forth. When it's left to unchecked market forces, it sometimes backfires dramatically. And that's the biggest challenge we have. So I say if you attack the issue at the fundamental level, whom does water belong to? And how are you going to manage the water and regulate the water? I think that's a very important part. If you look at a country like Israel or Singapore, both of them are very clear the water belongs to the people. It is not owned by the land you own or the water rights. It belongs to the people. And it is going to be managed by a particular agency for the government. And they are going to have equitable distribution. So that's where they have come about. In India, what we see is that government is managing, but it is not managing to the extent it should be done. And as a result, at the lower level, at the Gram Panchayat or the village level, there are local solutions which are emerging out here, though they are not adequate out here.
But they are replicable, right? If it works well in one district, you can do it elsewhere, right?
Yeah. And there are some good stories of that also.
Do share one or two, yeah.
So I've been working with an organization called IIT for IIT, which stands for IIT for Influencing India's Transformation. And they have taken about 12 solutions to make water accessible to farmers and people in rural India. Here, the mechanism works in a couple of ways. They provide a platform, provide a technology, and they created various watershed areas where they are asking the industry who have to spend certain amount of their money for corporate social responsibility to adopt an area and enable the region for any kind of corporates coming in and doing some work for watershed development or access to water development. So one of the success stories has been that one of the largest problem in India had been that most of the water storage bodies were silted. They evolved a very simple and a nice mechanism of desilting those and carting that silt out to make something called new soil for the farmers. And that area became a water storage. And economically, it was a very neutral thing. They sold the silt to the farmers. The farmers were very happy because they were getting good silt and good nutrient soil and a new soil. And they got water in return out here. So I think those kind of stories are very heartwarming. The other ones which I've heard is that simple things like groundwater recharge. We had been mining water, for a lack of better term. And nowadays, there are some simple solutions which are being implemented not very expensive on groundwater recharge. You see, these are some of the very heartwarming stories what we see. And one of the most amazing story I saw was in Himachal Pradesh, which is the hilly area in northern India, where they literally created proper septic tanks for managing the wastewater, sewage water, and within 3 years they were able to generate something like a few thousand septic tanks because they mobilized the government machinery very effectively. And they done a marvelous job. This is a very simple technology applied at scale, and it has made a huge difference in terms of the quality of water.
Now, one point you just made before I turn back to Peter again, one point you just made was about the ownership of water, who owns water. And there is an argument, of course, to be made that it belongs to all the people. But while the water belongs to the people, the infrastructure needed, you keep talking about the infrastructure needed for bringing it to the people, need to be paid for. The pipeline, the purification plants, the billing systems, the meters that you're talking about. And that's where the role of the business comes in. So I have a question for both of you. First, Ravi, you, and then Peter. In what way can business act in a way that can be meaningful for ensuring the accessibility of water?
Yeah, so I have kind of delved a little bit into this whole part. So one of the things which I've learned is a block tariff pricing of water really leads to a very interesting model which is self-sustainable. So a couple of evidences are that if you look at the city of Johannesburg, they have metered water and they price the water very nicely, where all people get certain amount of water free of cost, especially the poor, so that at least basic hygiene is maintained and basic hydration and requirements are maintained. And then there are block tariffs. The block tariffs are that every incremental amount of water you use, you are expected to pay more, not linearly, but a little more exponentially. And I personally feel it should come to a point that beyond a certain point for personal use, you should be blocking any further water coming to that particular source.
Yeah, and South Africa has a major water scarcity issue. And this, in fact, one of the interesting things for our friends keen on human rights issues is an Elspruit case, which took place in the South African Supreme Court, for example, because South Africa is one of the first countries to recognize water as a human right. Elsewhere, the movement came much later. Sorry, but do go on, yeah.
So I believe that block tariffs can do a wonderful job of that. What I've also learned, if you look at the case of the city of Dharwad in south central India, is when people were supplied with good quality water on a regular basis without any breakage, they were willing to pay for it. So if you do it reasonably, there is a business case for this where at least you can take care of, you can take care of maintaining the infrastructure as well as you are able to generate enough profits to plow it back. And this ecosystem is important because once you have a revenue set, you can literally borrow against that to create more infrastructure. So it is a very important role which industry plays and economics play in water, but it can become a political time bomb if not handled properly. But as the affluence is growing, this is getting to be more and more looked at, but it's not there as yet. For example, Bombay is paying really pittance for water, what we are getting, which is one of the very fine quality waters we have.
Yeah. Peter, turning to you, because US has a fairly sophisticated system of pricing and water and so on. And California, it is a live issue and you live in California. So reflections on that, if you have any. And the other is the stories that Ravi told us. And you did see some bad practices for water. Have you come across any good practices that companies can learn from?
I would frame this entire thing in what Ravi was saying, which is once people or institutions, corporations are given something for virtually nothing, it is nearly impossible to change habits to make them more responsible because they just regard it as a very low cost input to their business or to their lives for that matter. And that's the transition to all the world, frankly, but particularly in the drier places, the entire southwest of the United States being one. We are really experiencing that, and it's not an easy one. And our legal and government institutions are coming along quite slowly. I do agree that we do have pricing mechanisms and certainly technology and metering and things like that in most places or many places that help. But unless you have a policy in place, and I can give you some examples of that, it's almost worthless. And unless it's the right policy. As I mentioned before, we faced a drought in California beginning around the turn of the millennium, the century. Around 2000, we had something like 17, 18 drier than average years. It's really quite striking how it shifted in that period of time. And it culminated in 2022, as I mentioned. Along the way, in around 2012, 2013, 14, our governor, who had been governor for 8 years in the 70s, was Jerry Brown. So Jerry Brown had presided in a period of relative plentiful in terms of water supply in the 70s and came back as a much older and wiser man in the teens of this decade, the 2010 plus, during times of real scarcity. And he finally was able to prevail on the California legislature to do something about the groundwater mining, as Ravi put it, because it really is. That's exactly what it is. Not being replenished anywhere near as quickly as it used to be. And the law that they managed to negotiate, because they had given these very large farms, very politically powerful farms in the Central Valley of California, water for virtually nothing, with the infrastructure paid, these two grand canals that we have that bring water from the northern wet part of the state to the dry southern part through the interior in the middle, where all the agriculture is, were entirely state and federally subsidized. One was built by the state, one by the federal government. The state one actually built by Jerry Brown's father, who was governor in the 1950s. So Jerry had to come to terms with this in the teeth of the drought. And the law that they negotiated was a huge step in the right direction, but it has many flaws in it, and it's suffering as we are suffering as a result. One is, I mentioned before, the 40-year phase-in. So they have until essentially the middle of the 2050s to actually get to a sustainable level in the aquifer. And by that, I mean a level at which they are not drawing down the aquifer underground any faster than it is being replenished by rainfall and precipitation and recharge. And so that's a long time to wait. And it means, indeed, what is happening is that the agricultural interests, who right now in the last few years we've had wet years, so it's less pressing, but they will simply continue to draw that down so that the level at which it must be in the 2050s to be declared sustainable is going to be much lower than it is today, presuming we have several more droughts and they only worsen as climate change experts expect. So there's that huge flaw, is just the timing of it. But another one is the farmers were so powerful at the table in that negotiation when they designed this law. They got the government to say that there would be no meters. We are doing groundwater sustainability without meters. The farmers are not responsible to meter the amount of water they withdraw. And that's led to all kinds of technological solutions, mainly using satellites to measure the water coming out in terms of the crops being, how intensively you can tell from the evapotranspiration on crops how much water they're getting. So that's one way of measuring. Another one is we have terrible subsidence, as India does, and as many places do, from all this groundwater pumping, where the land itself is sinking. It's causing billions in infrastructure calamities. Actually, the canals are among the worst affected. So you have these canals taking water from north to south that have cracks in them, and that in some cases are able to pass that water at only half the rate of when they were built decades ago because of these cracks from subsidence. So it's a terrible, vicious cycle. So those are just some of the examples. Around the world, what's more successful? I think in Australia, they realized that they can't allow the investors, the speculators, to game in the water trading system as they did before. They set up as liberal a system as you can imagine, with the idea that the water would get to its best use. Remember, highest and best use in a fully neoliberalized system of water trading is what has been the practice in Australia. I think they realized, in part from some of the work we did, showcasing an enormous amount of water that was left behind a high dam in Southeast Australia, depriving dairy farmers and other food growers of water during a terrible drought a few years ago. And it turned out that water was being held back by speculators, by water traders. And there was no other explanation for it. And it was allowed because the water distribution system itself has been fully privatized in the Murray-Darling, so that they're depending on sort of private cooperatives to distribute the land. But those private cooperatives are being, the shareholdings of the water is being gamed and sold and gambled and speculated upon. And they are free to allow, if someone is able to get that much water and they'd say, we're leaving it behind the dam, and although there's half the precipitation this year or less, we're going to leave it behind the dam and sell it, and maybe we'll sell it next year or the year after. And they're fully allowed to do that. So the Australians are looking at that. There's a lot of agitation there. The very right-wing or conservative pro-farming or large farming government in New South Wales has given way to a more labor-oriented government, and I think they're taking it more seriously. But those are the things that happen. And without policy that does maintain a cost, I understand the cost has to be maintained for everyone, including food growers. They can't be allowed to just waste water, but it has to be realistically structured to accommodate scarcity, or to get us through scarcity, which we are experiencing all too often.
That's a wonderful note to end on. I think what I take back from this is there's a great need for regulation. There's a great need for better incentives. There's a great need for protection of the proper kind, for having the accountability and transparency that's needed, because there's been research from ICRC that people can survive for food for up to 4 or 5 or 7 days, and they can still be okay. But water needs to be there and then. If there's a natural disaster or a conflict, the first thing very often ICRC supports, that the International Committee for Red Cross and Red Crescent, is digging of water wells. So it is definitely a source of life and inextricably linked with the human rights, and therefore of course the private sector has a role to play, but it's extremely important that it is done in the right manner. So thank you, Ravi, for all the good work you do, and Peter, thank you so much for highlighting these stories for us.
Thank you, Salil.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks to Salil, Peter and Ravi for this insightful and interesting conversation. And thank you for listening to this episode of Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights in Business. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast, that way you will never miss an episode. And if you'd like to find out more about the work that we do at IHRB, then head to ihrb.org.